This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest, Mark Andrews, author of Paint My Name in Black and Gold, The Rise of the Sisters of Mercy. Leeds, 1980. Amid the violence and decay, the city contained an extraordinarily vibrant post-punk scene. Out of that swamp crawled the Sisters of Mercy. Over the next 5 years, they would rise from local heroes to leading alternative band before blowing apart on the verge of major rock stardom. Their path was strewn with brilliant singles, astonishing EPs, exceptional album tracks, and legendary live shows. 2 classic lineups were created and destroyed. Andrew Eldritch, the singer, Craig Adams on bass, Gary Marks and Ben Gunn, and later Wayne Hussey on guitars, and a drum machine called Dr. Avalanche. Hussey and Adams styled themselves as the Evil Children and played hard on and off stage. Neither Gunn nor Marks were natural rock and roll animals, but the latter performed with such wild abandon that it was hard to believe he wrote some of the Sisters' most beautiful music. Eldritch was the most peculiar and compelling of them all, a singular and mesmerizing amalgam of T.S. Eliot and David Bowie. He staked a powerful claim to be the greatest rock star of his generation and was almost consumed by his own myth in the process. Drawing on dozens of interviews with band members and key figures in the Sisters' journey, Paint My Name in Black and Gold is the most complete account yet of how, against the odds and all reasonable expectation, these young men came to make transcendent and life-changing music and embrace the glorious stupidity of being in a Leeds rock band. Smoke machines, leather trousers, lurid shirts, blood, vomit, reckless driving, and reckless sex. It is the story of the rise of one of Britain's greatest and most misunderstood rock bands. Mark Andrews is from Warwickshire and has lived and worked in the UK, Cairo, and now Belgium. He's the author of a series of long articles published in the Quietus on the early years of the Sisters of Mercy. He's also written for the Middle East Times, Bangkok Metro, Flanders Today, and Louder. To hear a playlist of Sisters of Mercy, including the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Mark, thanks so much for being on the podcast. How are you?
Thank you. I'm feeling good. COVID, I feel, is coming down the track towards me, but right now I'm feeling good.
We were just discussing this before we started recording. Yeah, your daughter tested positive, but you say she's okay, so that's good.
She's fine. She's young, so she's having a sleep at the moment, but yeah, with Omicron, it's almost certainly going to be passed on to the other members of the family. We're in quarantine.
Crazy, crazy times, but thankfully we do have the technology that we have. We were talking also, you are a teacher, and my brother and his wife are teachers, and just what I do here, thankfully we can still communicate with people and get things done virtually. I mean, where would we be if this happened 20 years ago or 30 years ago? You don't even want to go there.
Absolutely.
When did you become a fan of the Sisters of Mercy?
Getting into the Sisters, I can pinpoint reasonably accurately. It would have been in the early autumn of 1984. And at the school I was at, the older pupils, we were all boys. So the older boys had a common room with a record player in it. And someone put a Sisters of Mercy record on, which I didn't know at the time. And it had heavy drums, heavy bass, distorted guitar. And that was exactly what I was looking for at the time. Logical deduction tells me it was probably Floor Show, which had actually come out as a single at the end of 1982. I think it must have been that because, I do vividly remember what I responded to as much as what the precise song was. I had no clue who the Sisters of Mercy were. It was someone else who was into the band. When I look back and I think about, how come this song and other music by the band sort of got its claws into me, I think what's key is that I just kind of come out of a sort of traditional heavy metal phase. Iron Maiden's 4th album, the title of which escapes me, I really hated. I really liked the first 3. And whatever the 4th one was, it really killed off my interest in heavy metal. Probably unfairly, if someone had given me Powerage by AC/DC instead of For Those About to Rock by AC/DC, I might not have needed the Sisters. I might have just become an AC/DC fan. Because now, the Bon Scott era of AC/DC, I absolutely love that. And in some ways, it fulfills the same need that the Sisters of Mercy fulfilled when I was 16. And interestingly, it wasn't necessarily Andrew Eldritch's voice in the Sisters of Mercy that actually first interested me. Not at all. It was actually the musical elements to it. So I was definitely looking for something heavy, I was looking for something with drums, bass, and guitar. And I was just looking for something a bit different, as you do when you're sort of a teenager. Maybe it was a bit late for me. I was 16. Maybe other people did that when they were 13 or 12 or 11. And I was actually probably more into film music at the time. I probably had as many film soundtracks as I did as actual albums by bands at the time. I wasn't really that well informed about music. So, I loved Giorgio Moroder's Cat People album. And there's definitely bits of Sisters I can hear in that. There's actually a Sisters song from 1990, which sounds a lot like David Bowie singing, Putting Out Fire from Cat People. And also, I really loved Giorgio Moroder's American Gigolo album, which had Call Me by Blondie, although I'm not sure any of Blondie play on it. I just think it's Debbie Harry and Moroder and his guys doing it. And that kind of combination of guitar and sort of actually quite danceable rhythms really appealed to me. And that became more obvious in the Sisters actually after the period of the book. And I was also a big Joan Jett fan, which I think is the big giveaway. Dyed black hair, leather jacket, into Gary Glitter and the Ramones. That's also a description of Andrew Eldridge. So obviously, when I got into the Sisters, 1984, this is a great, great, fantastic era to be British. Still a great scene then. I'd missed punk completely. It had no impact on me whatsoever. To be honest, I'd missed most of post-punk as well, but it was still extremely lively for music. And I was just beginning to read the music press as well. The Sisters are actually sort of part of what I would describe as an education to get me into other bands. So I hadn't got a clue who the Stooges were until I found out the Sisters covered 1969. And then, this was a great gift for me because still to this day, Funhouse by the Stooges is categorically my favorite album. And I may never have heard of it if it hadn't been for the Sisters, because I didn't get into the Stooges through the punk connection at all. I love Suicide. Sisters covered Ghost Rider. I already knew I liked ABBA and Hot Chocolate because they were on the radio and on the TV when I was a kid. Sisters did cover versions of those as well. So there's a kind of transition period in which I can see why I might have liked the Sisters, and then the Sisters then take me through into other things as well, musically. And books and cinema and all sorts of ideas as well. I ended up knowing who Matisse is because Sisters, Andrew Eldridge ripped off Blue Nude by Matisse and used it for a cover. So they're a really important band to me in loads of ways. And it's that, I'm sure, like everybody else, it's at that moment in which, things are shifting and you're kind of like working out and trying to be who you want to be as a person. It's teenager stuff.
Yeah, it's that one band that opens you up to all the others. That's the beauty of discovering a band like this. And the book. So you decide to write the book. How long ago did you make the decision to start this project?
Yeah, so what happened is, I'm not, and I never claimed to be, I'm not a music journalist. I've never made a living like that, and I've never wanted to. But I've always done bits of journalism on the side since I was a teenager, actually, because I've spent a lot of my life teaching film. I tend not to want to write about that. As you said, I love music. So that tended to be the stuff that I would always do on the side. And in 2016, I'd already been doing a bit of writing for an online publication called The Quietus. And in 2016, I said to the editor, John Doran, I want to write something on the Sisters. I wasn't into them at the time. My interest had paled. But I still wanted to investigate this great relationship I had with them for more than 2 decades, which had sort of died. And I thought, I'd like to write about the Sisters because I'd been reading this blog called I Was a Teenage Sisters of Mercy Fan by Nicholas Vitus Lagacia. And that really interested me, even though I'd given up on the Sisters. So I said to John Doran, the editor of The Quietus, I'll write something, you don't have to pay me. And he said, all right then. And I got really into it. And I ended up, it was like a 15,000 word draft at one point. And I got it down to between 8,000 and 9,000. So it was this enormous article, just looking at a very small period of the Sisters that hadn't really been that well covered before, which was the very, very early part of their development. And as part of that, I spoke to John Keenan, who was such an important figure in Leeds, where the Sisters started. He was a promoter and ran the F Club, the club nights that he put on in Leeds. Amazing selection of live bands, and going down the F Club is where the original three sisters kind of knew each other from. I interviewed Keenan. I interviewed a couple of guys from another Leeds band called Salvation. I did a lot of research, which I like. And out of that, I wrote this article. And then it was done. And then I managed to interview Andrew Eldritch, which is not that easy to do. It coincided where he was about to play some festival dates. And I got a connection and he agreed to do the interview. When I said to him, look, I want to talk to you about old Leeds, his initial reaction was, well, I'd just as much prefer to talk about tartan wallpaper, as if like, don't bother me with this old news. And I said, okay, fair enough. I've got some other questions, some tour promo, blah, blah stuff that we could get through. We could start on Leeds. And if we don't like it, I'll just get the other file out. And he went, oh, yeah, okay then. And then when he realized I'd actually done some research and I told him a John Keenan story about ABBA on a video cassette, which I think is in the book, about John Keenan losing one of Eldritch's videos, which had ABBA on. I think then he realized that, okay, maybe he could actually talk to me. And we did an hour and a half, and that material went in the article, and that made it a much better article. And then from that, I wrote another one about a year later, I think, maybe more. And for that, I interviewed the other two original members of the band, Gary Marks or Mark Pearman, to give him his non-stage name. And I interviewed Craig Adams, the bass player. And I did this second article. And then from that, it occurred to me, well, I've written best part of 20,000 words. That's a fifth or a quarter of a book. Maybe there's a book in it. And round about the same time I was having this idea, I got contacted by a guy. To be honest, I'm not sure how to pronounce his surname. I don't know if it's Manuel or Manuel, but Rob, I'll say Manuel, Rob Manuel, who is apparently quite well known in certain circles in the UK because he runs this thing called Fesshole and various other tech things which he's done. And he said, look, I can connect you with Unbound, the publisher. I think they'd be interested in this book. And I said, okay, go ahead and connect me. And then on a very, very snowy February day I'm going to say 2018, in London, I met Rob and we went in to see Matthew Clayton, the head of publishing for Unbound, and we kind of agreed to do it. And the book came about through crowdfunding. So just because we agreed to do it didn't mean there was going to be a book. If we didn't reach the given target, which was 16,600 and something pounds, then there is no book. And then we did the crowdfunding. And when that was all set and done, I then set about actually writing the book.
Quite a feeling when you finally get that out after hearing that story.
Yeah, that was it was all fun. It's never felt like work, which is a good job because it's not my work. Yeah, the tricky bit was the crowdfunding. That was much slower than I expected. And I think all kind of hardcore sisters fan groups on Facebook and the forums, I think it was much slower than they expected. But in the end, we funded it at 154%. So in the end, it was fine, but it dragged for a while. And we had to put quite a lot of effort in to kind of provoke people to make their pledge to buy their book in advance. Otherwise, there would have been no book.
It's worth the wait. Great book. I did tell you also before we started recording, one of the great things I love about doing this podcast is, yes, I get to talk to authors of books on bands I love, but I also take on books about bands and artists that I may not know much about. And that allows me to discover a whole new band as if, just like you did years ago, for me, I experienced that. Now, I knew of a song or two, songs that were on MTV, but listening to them as I'm reading your book and setting up the questions, I'm asking myself, how did I miss out on this all those years ago? But here in the States, the Sisters of Mercy was popular, but they weren't up there with some of the other bands that were on the charts or that were on TV a lot. So it just
they never became Depeche Mode or The Cure.
Right. And I said to you, I'm a huge Cure fan. So it's just great. You get to discover these artists, and through your book, I get to learn so much about the band, and let's get to that. But before we get to the pages inside the book, I want to ask you about the cover photo. There's a wonderfully dark shot of the band in black and white. They're outside of an adult movie theater in Detroit.
If you're a Sisters fan, it's extremely well known because it's actually on the inner sleeve of their first album, First and Last and Always. So it's not like this, oh, great unfound image that's never been seen before. It's one of the best known photos of the band. And clearly Andrew Eldritch likes it. You know, he looks great in it because he chose it in the inner sleeve design that he did for the album. My suggestion for the cover to Unbound, which obviously they considered for about like 1 second because they wanted to sell some books, I suggested it should be like the cover to Funhouse by the Stooges, a sort of blend of faces of the different band members, with Eldritch's face being the biggest, like Iggy Pop on the cover. And they were like, yeah, thanks for that. We want a much more well-known image than that. So the head of publishing actually contacted the photographer's brother, the photographer being deceased, and got his permission for the rights to use it. The origin of the photo itself is that it's taken in the early part of 1984 when the sisters were playing a few US dates, not the first time they'd been to the US. And their regular promoter and booster was with them, Ruth Polsky, based out of New York. Apparently she drove them around Detroit. They went to various places of interest, including the Motown building, which I don't think was a museum then. I just think it was like there. I've been to it, I went to it a couple of years ago, so it's now like a massive tourist attraction. But I just think like the Motown building was just like there. And then they went to, I suppose, what's the Detroit equivalent of Times Square, the Cass Corridor. Interestingly, a couple of blocks from there now is Jack White's Third Man Records. There's rustic pizza, craft beer. Because it's Detroit, it hasn't been 100% gentrified. It's like half gentrified. But back in 1984, it was essentially Times Square, drugs, hookers, porno theaters. And the sisters stopped pointing south on Woodward Avenue. And Ruth Polsky took this picture of them outside the Sassy Cat, which you can just see in the image, you can just see the name of the theater on the left. And then behind them, it was suggesting that there were Detroit's finest adult movies inside. To Sisters fans, this photo is known as the Detroit's finest photo, which is one of the chapters in the book. And Ruth obviously let Andrew Eldritch have it. And Ruth Polsky unfortunately died in a terrible accident in New York a couple of years after that. She was waiting to go into a club and a taxi driver lost control and essentially ran her over while she was standing outside the club. So in New York music, Ruth Polsky is an amazing figure, totally important for any alternative British band that came over, Sisters included. Sisters liked her a lot. She liked the Sisters a lot. Not just this photo, but the relationship between her and the band is really important to getting them established in the US. So she booked bands into Danceteria. And that was the sort of the Sisters' first port of call in the US in 1983. There's the typical route in for bands. You'd go in, play nights at Danceteria. Maybe she'd fix you up for nights in Boston or Philadelphia or Trenton or something like that. And then occasionally Detroit and Chicago. And she'd hook bands up, as with the Sisters, with a guy called John Hanty, who would do the driving, provide the van, do the sound at gigs. So there's this very sort of important but narrow conduit into the US, and Ruth Polsky was it, and totally vital for the Sisters.
And what about the title, Paint My Name in Black and Gold? That's a lyric from their song Heartland. Easy choice for a title, or did you have other contenders?
No. Well, I tried out all sorts of different things. I had a working title for ages, which was a line from Apocalypse Now, which was shot with a diamond bullet, because Eldritch is a massive Apocalypse Now fan. Apparently he could do the whole dialogue whilst watching the film, and it's a long film. That and the Blues Brothers, he just knew all the dialogue for. So there's something curtsy there's something of a journey upriver for Eldritch in the book. So I was playing around with this Apocalypse Now idea, and I was like not fully happy with it. I had Heartland as a title for a while because I thought I was going to be writing a book that was just as much about Leeds, the hometown of the Sisters, and West Yorkshire, as I was going to write a book about the band. As it turned out, I did have a lot of Leeds material in, but it turned into like a Sisters book. So Heartland had to go as a title. And I was looking for a title that was something like Meet Me in the Bathroom, the title of the Strokes and Interpol era New York scene by Lizzie Goodman, I think. I love the title. Yeah, I thought Meet Me in the Bathroom's a great title. So Paint My Name in Black and Gold is this sort of attempt to do a sort of Meet Me in the Bathroom title. And I was looking for a Sisters lyric as well. And also Paint My Name in Black and Gold kind of does summarize the two elements of the sisters. Obviously, they're associated with black, and the book is the story about essentially their success as well. So, yeah, so I like that. I haven't like regretted it. I haven't thought of anything better since. So there it is, paint my name in black and gold.
And you mentioned Leeds. This is where the band's from, so let's get to that. They're formed in Leeds, England in 1980, and in the preface, you take us back to a Sunday afternoon, late summer 1980, at 12 St. John's Terrace in the Hyde Park area of Leeds. And it's there in the top floor flat that the core trio of this band comes together. Can you take us back to that day?
Yeah, so that kind of dating is like best guess from members of the band because they can't remember it exactly. It's a process of elimination. So we know when their first single came out, was played on the radio, I think in October 1980. So working backwards from there, that's roughly the date. But this kind of meeting of the three of them definitely took place in this top floor bedsit flat in, do North Americans know what a bedsit is? Or is that a British term?
That is a British term, yeah.
So a bedsit is basically a flat that won't have its toilet and shower on the inside. Like, what would you call it? A studio. Europeans might call it a studio flat, but you would have to like leave and go to a shared bathroom. So it would be the cheapest form of accommodation you could get after you left home if you were young.
It's not a palatial estate.
No, God, no. It's this is the cheapest form of accommodation that you could get without going into some kind of shared house. So yeah, it would have been cheap. It was in the cheap area of Leeds. I don't know. Obviously, Leeds has revived somewhat in the last couple of decades. So nowhere will be that. It's not the cheap area anymore, but it's still the area for students. It always was because it's north of the university and then what was called the Polytechnic, but now is a university. So it's always been the student area. Student areas traditionally will be amongst the cheapest places to live. And at the time, the audition took place. Andrew Eldritch he wasn't a student, but he would have recently stopped being one. So the reason he was in Leeds was to study Chinese studies at the university. The other two members of the band didn't go to university. They're in Leeds for different reasons. So yeah, it was Andrew Eldritch, or Andy Taylor, as he was then, and Mark Perman, as he was then, had a duo. They'd never played live. They'd never made a record. And they invited Craig Adams, who was by far the better known figure, to come and audition as the bass player. He didn't have a bass. He'd never played one. He borrowed one for the audition. He was a keyboard player in his previous bands who were much better known in Leeds, not nationally known. Yeah, and he turned up with his bass guitar and a fuzz box, played his riff to floor show, as it happens. And that was it. They had him in the band because I think, as the book says, he was objectively slumming it by auditioning for Andy Taylor and Mark Perman, who were just, this is 1980. They'd been faffing around for a long time. They weren't young. They were 21 by this point. So, but that is the core trio. Eldritch Taylor was he was the drummer. They hadn't got the drum machine yet. He was the drummer, did some singing. He also played guitar, and Mark Perman was guitar player and also did some singing. And it's the very, very kind of earliest version of the Sisters of Mercy.
There is a fourth member of the band. Who or what is Dr. Avalanche?
Well, it's various forms of drum machine. So Dr. Avalanche is still in the band, and it's laptops of some description. I don't know what they're playing through them, but if you go to a Sisters gig now, there's a guy called Ray B. Davey who stands at the back, and he appears to have two laptops in front of him. Exactly what he's doing is a bit of a mixture, but out of those two laptops are coming the drums and other things as well.
It's spelled D-O-K-T-O-R, by the way. Where did they come up with that name, Dr. Avalanche?
Well, they used to say, and I never actually got anyone to challenge this, so it could just be something they made up for fun, but it's claimed to be the name of a Swiss football referee. So I've always assumed, I just never investigated that. Even now, yes, maybe I should check that. But it's because the first drum machine they used was a Dr. Rhythm, a Boss DR55 Dr. Rhythm drum machine, which did virtually nothing. It's extremely primitive, very, very tick-tock kind of drum machine. And that's the first one they had. Of course, it would be quite expensive then. But the great advantage is that it allowed Eldritch to become the singer, because no way was the band going to have a singing drummer. the quote from Mark Pearman is that, Eagles, 10cc, Genesis, singing drummer, no fucking way. Am I allowed to swear on the podcast?
Oh, absolutely. Yes,
yeah.
you can.
So the idea of the singing drummer was out. So the drum machine filled that function. Also, because they were not living in, as you say, palatial residences, storing a drum kit, finding somewhere to rehearse with the drummer is actually not that easy. So actually just having a small amp and a small drum machine actually made rehearsing easier. And Mark Pearman, Gary Marks, and I'll just use their stage names, Gary Marks and Andrew Eldritch. They both love Suicide. They both love the Human League. So they both love drum machines. And because by his own admission, Gary Marks was such an undeveloped guitar player, struggled with keeping it in tune, struggled with forming any fingerings, didn't really play chords, timing all over the place, that actually having a drum machine which would be impeccably in time somehow balanced out the sort of chaos and error-strewn nature of his playing. He wouldn't dispute me on that.
Yeah, well, interesting how that leads to the sound of the Sisters of Mercy.
At some point, there is a concept. They are trying to be Suicide crossed with the Stooges. It might not have always sounded like that, but that's kind of the concept. Or because they were both, Gary Marks and Eldritch, loved, or think of it as the Human League. I actually kind of prefer that, even though Eldritch was copying Alan Vega a lot in the way that he was singing. The Human League crossed with the Stooges. Yeah, they were always an electronic band as well.
You mentioned the name changes. Let's talk about that. Gary Marks was then called Mark Pearman. Andrew Eldritch was Andy Taylor. When did they change their names, and why those specific names?
The story is that, the wrong story is that people changed their names in Leeds to avoid being caught by the unemployment office, that they were claiming unemployment benefit, but actually were getting a small income from being in a band. So to avoid being caught by the DHSS, I don't know what the North American equivalent of that is, but in order to be caught by the authorities claiming benefits when in fact you were working, bands would change their names. That's often said, but isn't true, because Mark Pearman actually had a job, so he wasn't claiming benefits. And Eldritch didn't change his name till much, much later. Mark Pearman, who changes his name to Gary Marks first, partly as a joke, partly by an error, is that Eldritch's girlfriend, Claire Shearsby, for some reason always used to call him Gary by mistake. And when the time came to pay the invoice for the first recording, when they were given the invoice, Pearman was asked, well, what do I put on it? The guy is calling you Mark, Claire's calling you Gary. What do I put? He said, I'll just put both down. And therefore from that came Gary Marks, Marks. And then later on, he changed it to Marx, as in Marx and Lenin, because of his, quote, credentials as a working class hero. So his name change is just a bit of fun. No one really called him Gary within the band. He's always Mark. Even now, no one calls him Gary, people who know him. I don't. When I did interviews with him, I don't address emails to Gary. It's Mark Pearman. Eldritch is a bit more complicated. Round about the time they make their first clearly, obviously good record, which is Alice with Floor Show on the B-side, I think there's some awareness in him that actually he might be in a band that can continue and be a vehicle for something successful rather than just a bit of fun, delaying having to go and get like a real job. And I think somewhere round about that time, as part of his way of presenting himself, he decides that he needs a different name. Also because there are loads of Andy Taylors, including the guitar player for Duran Duran. So he picks Eldritch. Exactly why is unclear. It could be the word Eldritch as an adjective, which means sort of weird, hideous, terrible, which is also related to Lovecraft, the Eldritch Abominations. But there's also a Philip K. Dick novel. Is it The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch? The some number stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. Philip K. Dick, notorious speed freak. Eldritch was consuming a lot of medication, as he would put it at the time. Maybe some kind of combination of all three. There we are. The difference is also related to a persona which Eldritch adopts in different ways and which changes. The need for it changes as the band develops. Whereas for Mark Pearman, it's just a name. He's pretty much the same guy from beginning to end. Eldritch, there's some degree of transformation related to his name change.
It's interesting, the parallel. Andrew's a big fan of David Bowie. David Bowie was born David Jones. So and he changed his name because, like you say, with Andrew and Andy Taylor of Duran Duran, David Bowie, Davy Jones, the Monkees.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yes. And also, obviously, Bowie adopted a sequence of personae as well. Eldritch is a known massive Bowie fan as a teenager, and obviously Bowie is a massive influence. He always downplays that. If you ask him in interviews, he'll always swerve past that one. And obviously his early singing style is also rooted in Bowie. And I think it's 72 to 76 Bowie that we're talking about here. So it would be an interesting project if Eldritch would give you answers, which he won't, just to investigate the relationship between Bowie and Eldritch, because I think it's very complicated and it's worth examining. But I don't feel fundamentally that the Eldritch persona is quite the same, the way that Bowie would move from Ziggy to Thin White Duke, etc. I think Bowie's is theatrical, and there's something else going on with Eldritch, actually. I think it's something he chooses to deploy in his private life as well. Chose to deploy in his private life and in his business dealings. And therefore the Eldritch persona becomes useful to him off stage and outside the music business as well. That's speculation.
What about the term gothic rock? No artist likes to be labeled in general, but Andrew didn't like that his band was referred to as a gothic rock band, right?
No, several reasons. One is that he would have considered the other bands labeled as gothic rock to be absolutely rubbish for a start. Even before goth was called goth, when it was called positive punk, he was complaining about how terrible these bands were, some of which he'd even played on bills with in the UK. So there's like a standards issue as well. Yeah, he just thought, and he was right, this band's much better than these so-called goth bands.
But I also feel, too, artists just don't like to be labeled because it puts them in a box. They don't like that.
True.
I think psychologically they feel constricted by that.
Yeah, and also Eldritch, even very early on, is incredibly ambitious. And he felt he was working in a medium of rock and roll. He felt he's playing around with the big genre of rock rather than something narrow like goth. So it's also related, I think, to his ambitions as well. And he came to resent it even more, that as the Sisters were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, he felt, particularly in the US, why am I not getting played on the radio more when these other bands are? And it's because I've got this millstone around my neck of being called a niche goth band. Whereas if people called me a rock performer, I'd sell more records and be playing bigger halls. So yeah, you're quite right. He has no time whatsoever with the Sisters being called a goth band, except for these days, he's accepted that being called, for example, the overlord of darkness and the inventor of goth rock helps him to be booked for festivals for stupid amounts of money. And as he says, maintains his swimming pool. So I think he's accepted the financial benefits of it, but he's obviously repeatedly chafed against it his entire career. Even way back when that wave of goth was coming up in the early 80s, he was against it even then. He was against it before it was even called goth.
What about the band name? The Captains of Industry, that was a serious contender for the name of the band early on. This is when it was
I don't know for how long.
Okay,
but
and that was when it was just the duo of Andrew and Gary, or as you call him, Mark, but that's early on. But instead they choose Sisters of Mercy. This is so, you would never predict this. This is a Leonard Cohen song. Can you talk about why they were so drawn to that particular song title? Andrew later said it was a nice 50-50 balance between nuns and prostitution. What a quote.
Yeah.
Can you give some background to that?
Yeah, well, there is your answer, is that Eldritch likes references and images. That would have worked very nicely for him. But he's a Leonard Cohen fan, so the song Sisters of Mercy would have been known to him. The images associated, the symbolism of the word, Eldritch is a symbolist. The symbolism of the word would have been quite compelling, I think. And of course, he's been right. It's a great, great name for a band.
It is. And there's something in your book, a Leonard Cohen story about two girls showing up at his hotel room.
Yes, there's a biography of Leonard Cohen by a very excellent music journalist called Sylvie Simmons. in which Cohen tells a version of how he wrote Sisters of Mercy. Well, of course, Leonard Cohen was a great embroiderer and mythologizer of Leonard Cohen's own story. So the version which is in the Sylvie Simmons book is the embroidered version. The reality which Cohen, we assumed, was more real, but closer to reality, the version that Cohen told to a different biographer is much more prosaic. But essentially, the story is that two women end up in his room. There is no sex. So he uses nuns as the metaphor for the song which he wrote, apparently while they were asleep, and then played it to them in the morning. The embroidered version has this taking place during a snowstorm in, I think, Edmonton. If memory serves, the prosaic version just takes place at a sort of faculty party. Cohen had been staying in someone's house and had been invited to a faculty party at the university. But the core of the story, which is that two women were in his room, he just wrote the song, nothing happened, and he played them the song. I think that's true. The reason Eldritch picked it is because he is a cinephile, and he knew the Robert Altman film McCabe and Mrs. Miller, in which the Leonard Cohen song Sisters of Mercy is used ironically, directly related to prostitutes in that film. It plays towards the beginning of the film.
There's a cool Vincent Price connection to the band's record label too, Merciful Release.
Yeah, so obviously merciful release is a phrase which pre-exists. But yeah, Mark Pam and Gary Marks could remember that in the good old days of British television where, they'd have a lot of films on, particularly late at night, to fill up the schedules, that there was like a very minor Vincent Price film called The Oblong Box, in which someone comments that the death of a character is a merciful release. And that kind of solidified the choice they'd already made to have Merciful Release as their record label. When you say record label, that meant just a name, which they put on the sleeve of their first 7-inch, which I suppose technically, they did self-release it. They got it distributed out of an important distributor in York, also in Yorkshire, obviously. But yeah, and then Merciful Release did actually become a proper record label.
I can hear Vincent Price. There's no need for sorrow. In his case, oblivion was a merciful release.
Yes.
That's an Edgar Allan Poe story.
I think so, yeah. Yeah. The clip, if anyone wants to geek out on this, I think that clip is available on YouTube.
I love Vincent Price.
The film is not well known. It's not one of the classic Poe adaptations. It's a minor work. 1969, The Oblong Box, I think.
Makes me think of Black Sabbath, named after the movie with Boris Karloff.
It's that kind of thing with the sisters where you go, do you think Eldritch is actually, is it like, because he's a cryptic crossword nut, which is obviously related, all these kind of little intra-textual references, and you wonder, is it actually referencing Black Sabbath? Probably not, because Eldritch doesn't like Black Sabbath, but that's one of the great things about Eldritch as a lyricist and as a symbolist, is that there's probably more going on than he intends, or you're able to come up with speculation that he never intended. These kind of games of trying to interpret what he means have kept Sisters fans amused. I include myself in this. Have kept Sisters fans amused for decades, digging into what does this mean on the record sleeve? What does that quote in the song mean? Particularly when you get into his lyrics, you can go on for like a long, long time trying to interpret them. Other people do this much more than I would. They're essentially cryptic.
I love that stuff. Don't tell us what it means. We'll figure it out on our own, or try to figure it out.
Exactly.
Everybody will have their own interpretation.
And if you do think you figured it out, Eldritch will tell you it means something different.
You could write a whole book on him. You could go deeper into his life. You could do a whole
book. I mean, obviously I spent a long time researching this one, and Eldritch remains a mysterious figure.
Yeah. What about the band's logo? Talk about where they got that from and their reasoning behind it. Andrew and Gary came up with that logo, right?
So it's a combination of two different things. One is a 5-pointed star, and laid over that is the dissection of neck and head from Grey's Anatomy, which shows the strategic points on the head and neck where you would make an incision and peel back the skin. So you've got this incredibly sort of macabre image from an anatomy textbook put over a 5-pointed star. Now, Eldritch at the time, or even since, says that the 5-pointed star is a sort of reference to the band's sort of leftist credentials. To me, it looks more like a pentagram. So to me, it's this really kind of on the one hand, quite a funny, macabre image that you've got like this sort of black magic symbol with this flayed head on top, which is just, excessive. Looks great. That's the main thing. It looks great. And then on the other hand, well, what is it? It's death's head. And the idea of the skull as an image, obviously is a long history in art, but it's also something you associate with the SS. And Eldritch comes from that background where intellectually you can bifurcate morality and aesthetics. So obviously the SS are vile, but that is a great image, the death's head. Eldritch is on record as a younger man saying, the SS uniforms look amazing. He himself is an anti-fascist. So he's quite capable of, which you can debate whether you can or not do this, but he would argue as a young man, I don't know if he would now, that you can separate the sort of power of images from the morality behind them. So again, typical Sisters, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on with that image. It's both shocking and funny, and I think that's very Sisters.
Your words, part Red Army faction, part Alice Cooper.
Yes. If you look at the image, there's certain things around the corners of the mouth that look like Eldritch is an Alice Cooper fan. There's certain things around the corner of the mouth and the head that don't look unlike Alice Cooper. And an earlier draft of it does look more like the emblem of the Baader-Meinhof group, which was a 5-pointed star with an AK-47 across it. So I don't know if Eldritch is directly influenced by that. Obviously, that's not a Nazi image, that's a left-wing image. But whether the kind of political imagery that he would have been aware of, whether that directly feeds in, I don't know. Saying that it looks like the image of an emblem of a macabre leftist cell, that's me, not anyone in the band. That's just my observation.
By the way, if you are listening to this podcast while you're driving, wait until you get home to Google that photo. Don't do it while you're driving. But I can picture people right now listening at home, looking at the picture now.
To see the original draft of it, which is hand-drawn by Eldritch, you'll need the book.
Exactly.
The early draft is the first picture in the book, which is absolutely fascinating because they cut it into a circle and put a hole in the middle, and you can see glue stains on it because they'd been putting it onto someone else's 7-inch record to see what this image looked like spinning on a turntable, which of course it looks great spinning on a turntable. And it looks even better as T-shirts. The Sisters sold a lot of T-shirts with that image on.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Time to check out the new and upcoming Books on Rock releases. Released this week, Bob Dylan, All the Songs, The Story Behind Every Track, the Expanded Edition, by co-authors Philippe Margotin and Jean-Michel Guidon, released through Black Dog and Leventhal Books. An updated edition of the most comprehensive account of Bob Dylan's Nobel Prize-winning work yet published, with the full story of every recording session, every album, and every single released during his nearly 60-year career. Margotin and Guidon also have released the Rolling Stones All the Songs Expanded Edition, The Story Behind Every Track. This also released through Black Dog and Leventhal. A comprehensive visual history of the world's greatest rock and roll band as told through the recording of their monumental catalog, including 29 studio and 24 compilation albums, and more than 100 singles. Also released this week, Hide Your Love Away, an intimate story of Brian Epstein as told by Larry Stanton, by Robin Bragg Marcelli, Rick Marcelli, and Larry Stanton, released through Trine Day Star. While Brian Epstein was basking in the attainment of Beatlemania, and with the Beatles traveling worldwide, he was struggling with what was considered at the time a concealed darker side of life. Hide Your Love Away shares Brian and Larry's quest for true love and supportive companionship when the laws in England and the U.S. kept gay men and women locked in the closet. Some books coming out soon, due out January 28th through Sonic Bond Publishing, Electric Light Orchestra, Every Album, Every Song, by Barry Delve. As well as examining all of ELO's recorded catalog, Delve has spoken to many people who have been involved with the band over the decades, uncovering along the way previously unseen photographs and new information about the group and their recordings, making this one of the most comprehensive guides to ELO ever published. And due out February 1st through Sona Books, Genesis, A Trick of the Tail by Peter Crisp, a comprehensive look at the supergroup that is Genesis, following the origins of the band with its founding members Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, and Phil Collins, who joined in 1970, to the years when the legendary Peter Gabriel was the frontman of the band. For a list of all the newest and upcoming Books on Rock releases, just head over to our website, bookedonrock.com. Talking with Mark Andrews, author of Paint My Name in Black and Gold, The Rise of the Sisters of Mercy, which is out through Unbound Books on February 8th, most places. Some it's already out. We'll get to that later. Leeds plays a big role in the band's sound, image, and attitudes. And as you write, throughout their ascent, the Sisters remain steadfastly a Leeds band. Sister songs are Leeds songs. Can you talk about Leeds? What was it like in the late 70s, early 80s when the band formed?
Well, I'll summarize that in the words of Craig Adams, the bass player, which are Leeds, it was a shithole, but it was ours. Leeds is a classic example of a once thriving northern industrial city that went into rapid deindustrialization and was in terrible, terrible shape, economic shape, by the end of the 1970s and in the early 80s. And then it gets even worse during the Thatcher government. Also in this mix of economic and social decay, there's a serial killer on the loose. So for anyone who's British of my age knows exactly who the Yorkshire Ripper is, who, when the Sisters form, is still at large, killed 13 women. So that's a whole different story that reflects on society and policing at the time. So yeah, you see, you've got a serial killer, you've got a very large fascist movement based in Leeds, parties like the National Front and the BNP, but you've also got a very vibrant anti-fascist movement. The Rock Against Racism was centred mainly in the Polytechnic at Leeds as well. So you've got this political stew. Leeds itself is a sort of ethnically mixed city, predominantly white, but also with big South Asian and Caribbean and Jewish communities as well. So that all factors into the sort of volatility. And amidst all, also there's quite a lot of tension between the students, who would have been seen as a privileged minority back then, and the locals in Leeds. There would have been class differences as well, factoring into that tension. And in the middle of all this, you've got this amazing music scene. The sort of city version of it, as I've said, is John Keenan's F Club. A whole host of fantastic touring bands went through. Virtually, if you name me a punk or a post-punk band that existed, they played at the F Club, and Craig Adams and Mark Behrman would have seen them.
You describe it in a book as a heaven for outsiders, misfits, and music fans.
Yeah, the emphasis may be more on music fans, but it is, yeah, it's your typical, as it was described to me, sweaty punk club, you know, bad sound, terrible beer, but it's not nearly as violent as Leeds itself. Being a punk rocker in Leeds, or dressing differently, you know, invited violence. That's not just true of Leeds, you know, reading Bobby Gillespie's book on Glasgow, it's also true of Glasgow. But yeah, Leeds is a decaying, violent city with this amazing music scene. And Eldritch arrives right at the kind of peak moment of the F Club.
About a decade before that, The Who puts it on the map, live at Leeds.
This is true. This is a different music scene. This is in the refectory of the university, a kind of legendary music venue. So yeah, so great bands, bigger bands would go through and play at the refectory. The Ramones, Eldritch saw the Ramones within a few days of arriving in Leeds in 1978. And then there's also the Polytechnic, which is now called Leeds Beckett University. But then it was the Poly. That was actually quicker out of the gate to sort of seize on punk and post-punk, if you want to call it that, than the university. So you've got these two great venues slightly to the north of the city, and then down in the heart of the city, right in the old ancient decayed black heart of Leeds, down by the river, the port of Leeds, such as it is, right by the railway station, you've got the F Club, which was in Brannigan's, a cellar venue. Low stage, low ceiling, very, very kind of atmospheric in all sorts of ways down there, you know, bare bones, you know, a real dive, but amazing. It's not the university and the Poly. The Sisters grow out of the F Club. So even though Eldritch had been a student, he always describes the Sisters as being a town band. And he's right about that, fundamentally right.
As far as Andrew Eldritch, the press release for the book includes an interesting statement regarding him, and it reads, quote, "He staked a powerful claim to be the greatest rock star of his generation and was almost consumed by his own myth in the process." Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I wrote that.
You did write that, okay.
Yeah, and I stand by it. You know, I've had Sisters fans, you know, who didn't know I wrote that say, come on, yeah, Eldritch's not one of the greatest rock stars. He never became that big. And it's got nothing to do with how many records he sold or how many people he's played to in gigs. Yeah, I stand by that. Eldritch is the epitome, a culmination of that kind of Iggy Bowie, kind of Alice Cooper, kind of rock star, performed with a great deal of wit and irony. But yeah, at his peak, Eldritch is a fantastic performer, looked amazing, gave great interviews, wrote fantastic lyrics, and the Sisters were an amazing live band in this period. I saw them once and don't remember it, but anyone else, even like not really Sisters fans, they say, yeah, that was a heavy, heavy, powerful rock band. They were as loud as hell and really great. So yeah, I stand by the statement that Eldritch is a great rock star, and he takes it too far. And that's where you get into the debate about the relationship between him and his persona, which I don't have an answer for, but he's in bad shape by 1984 and 1985. He recovers from that and then goes on to be a bigger star with this Corrosion and Dominion and Lucretia and et cetera, et cetera.
This guy was he was an intelligent guy. You even write he was highly intelligent with an idiosyncratic mind and sardonic worldview that impressed those who knew him. What was it you think that pulled him away from that world, meaning he could have gone on to be a professor if he wanted. He should have been at Oxford University beginning the second year of his modern languages degree when he is instead hanging out at the F Club. What was it that took him away from that world and into his desire to become the greatest rock star of his generation?
Well, the first thing is that he absolutely hated the degree at Oxford. So that's the first thing, is that his route to following an academic path would have required him to enjoy being at Oxford, which he did not for all sorts of reasons. And he's also sufficiently contrarian and sufficiently self-aware to actually leave the university, whereas a lot of people might grind it out. So actually having a bad experience at Oxford, that's the reason I put it in the book, because you've got to get into Leeds and you've got to get him into the F Club, and for that he has to leave Oxford. And then the Chinese course he was on would have required extreme amount of hard work. The Chinese course, which he transferred to from French and German, was demanding for students. They would have had to put in a lot of effort learning Chinese. And I think by that point, he was more interested in hanging out down the F Club. So he didn't fancy that.
He was not from Leeds, as you said. He was from Ely, but he wasn't there long.
Yeah. So he's born there. I didn't really investigate much on purpose exactly what is going on in his life before the age of 18, because I didn't feel it would be that relevant, and I'm actually not that nosy. But we know that Eldritch is born in Ely, but as best as I'm aware, he grew up and went to school in the southeast of England. In Britain, we would call the home counties, the kind of London fringe. So by accent, Eldritch is clearly from the sort of southeast of England. So,
but it just wasn't his life. That wasn't the life he really wanted to lead. He would have been way too constricted, but he could have made a nice living for himself, I'm sure. Instead, he takes that risk.
He could have been a very successful lawyer, journalist, worked for the BBC, that kind of thing. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure those would have been the right jobs for him. Rock and roll performer and artist. I can't see how he could have done better than that.
We talked about the David Bowie influence. What other influences make up the Sisters' sound? Motorhead, too.
Certainly. That particularly comes from the bass playing of Craig Adams, who's a massive Motorhead fan, as is Eldritch. The drum machine, obviously, is the Human League and Suicide influence. Beyond that, the influence is that they can only play what they can play with the equipment they've got and the ability to play it. So whatever influences they might wanted to draw on, most of those are out their reach, because none of them can play the guitar that well, and they're limited by their ability. And in some ways, that's their great strength. They can't afford much equipment and they don't play so well, and therefore they have to find their talent within certain parameters. And that's one of the reasons why I love those early, until up to and including 1983. I love those records and those live shows because they are really primitive. And then when they get a guitar player in who can play and who has equipment, the sound changes, which I like in a different way. But that very primitive band, which is a cheap drum machine with a fuzz pedal on the bass, homemade fuzz boxes on cheap guitars, and vocal echo on Eldritch's mic is basically the only effect. That's the palette that they're working from. So, yeah, it is Stooges, Suicide, Motorhead. And then there'll be a whole bunch of other stuff which is sort of buried beneath that, or which they're alluding to through lyrics and interviews and cover art and things like that. But like having influences in a sort of traditional sense, in some ways is beyond them.
Chapter 4, titled Slow, Slow, Quick, Quick, Slow. The band tried to make their first record. Was it like an EP or was
a 7-inch single called The Damage Done with a song called Watch and a very short song called Home of the Hitmen on the B-side. It's absolute rubbish. Really rubbish. That's with Eldritch playing the drums.
Okay. Yeah, and this is where things went badly wrong at Rick Rack Studios in Leeds, right?
Yeah. It's very hard to find anything good to say about that single. I can't find anything good to say about it. It's really bad and doesn't necessarily sound like anything that, well, it really doesn't sound like anything that comes after it. There's no drum machine. Craig Adams is not playing on it. 2 of the songs are sung by Gary Marks. So it's a strange sort of pre-Sisters misfire, let's say. The authentic band is the 3 of them that came together in that audition in the Top Floor Bedsit.
And similar to their first ever gig, too. February 16, 1981, a college in York. Yeah. This is where the White Witch...
That was terrible as well.
Yeah, this is where the White Witch ceremony story comes from. Can you talk about that first gig?
Yeah, I've never heard that. The actual White Witch ceremony, their intro tape, it's not on any bootlegs, and the Sisters have been bootlegged a lot, but it definitely existed. Eldritch has mentioned it. Craig Adams has mentioned it. It's some kind of spell or incantation that Eldritch bought from black magic shop in Esoterica, a shop selling esoterica in the area of Leeds that he lived in. The shop was called the Sorcerer's Apprentice. So the guy who ran the shop, who was into all that stuff, apparently a major figure if you're in that world of esoterica and Aleister Crowley and all that. The tape is him intoning the White Witch ceremony. But exactly what is on it, I do not know because there's no evidence. But yeah, that was their intro tape.
And it just kept playing and playing?
Apparently it went on for ages. Yeah, because they didn't have that many songs, so they would run the intro tape for a while.
When did they start to gel live?
Good question. In my personal opinion, you could definitely hear them start to come together in 1982. There are things in the bootleg. They didn't play live that often in 1981, their kind of first year of live gigs. You can hear sort of bits and pieces in 1981. Are going to be better later. But, they really start to get it together in late 1982, I believe. And over that kind of winter into early 1983, when they started to gig more, they had better songs. They still have rubbish equipment. And I think there's a sort of energy in the band where they realize that they're good. And that gives them the confidence to really enjoy playing live. But I think during that period, end of 1982 was when everyone in the band really starts to realize that they're in a great band.
How important is Peter Turner? You talk about the sound engineer that they meet.
Well, let me say that in a different way. How important is Claire Shearsby? Because before Pete Turner turns up, Claire Shearsby, who was the DJ in the F Club, who also happened to be Eldritch's long-term girlfriend, she was doing the sound for the band. She was learning as well, like all of them. And her input doing the sound in these early cheap gigs that they were doing, she's important as well. So that's one of the reasons why there's a picture of Claire in the book, because she's not only in Leeds, not only this sort of important cultural figure as the F Club DJ, she DJed in other places as well, that she does perform the function of sound engineer for the Sisters. Yeah, some gigs were rough and ready, but when they get access to a little bit more money and they get a professional sound engineer in, who's Pete Turner, who, to the best of my knowledge, still is a sound engineer. And at some point in his career, he's worked for Brian Ferry and Roxy Music, not the 70s, 80s iterations. Yeah, so Pete Turner, I think, really understood how to make the band sound good on stage. If he wasn't good, Eldritch wouldn't have worked with him. There would have been confrontations and sackings, and Pete wouldn't have been there. So you can tell that Pete was doing a great job because he's the Sisters sound engineer. That's a very fruitful relationship between him and Eldritch from about 1983 to 1985. Same with a guy called Phil Whiffin, who did the lights as well. That's very productive as well. Successful, creative working relationship.
How would you describe a Sisters of Mercy concert for those who've never seen them live?
Well, it depends in which era you're talking about. So the classic Sisters gig is these great banks of smoke, not dry ice. Dry ice apparently stays close to the floor. It's actually the smoke machines and wind machines on, completely covering the stage in smoke, which then the lighting designer, who is basically Phil Whiffin, had worked out how to make the band look great, how to silhouette them. Eldritch was very specific about how he wanted to be lit as well. So it's this mixture of a very sort of psychedelic, I think that's the correct word, this kind of very psychedelic experience, and also something Eldritch would describe as bozo and heavy metal and gut-wrenching, this kind of stupid amounts of smoke. At some point, you can't even see the band. And then as the smoke would settle down, you would have these silhouettes. And it's extremely effective when it's done well. It's like being in a film noir. You see these great photos of the band, particularly Eldritch, and it is like something like shot by, John Alton, or like something from Citizen Kane, or a great sort of crime thriller. And the emphasis on color is because Eldritch was a big Mario Bava nut as well. So these very, very intense color scheme that he's using as well. So it's a very visual experience. None of that is true before 1984. Before 1984, it's four blokes on a stage. I kind of like the kind of bare bones sisters, which it's just the four of them on stage. And three of them don't have stage wear as such. They have not dressed up. And of course, Eldritch didn't have stage wear. The whole shades and leather jacket and leather trousers and biker boots, all that. He used to wear that off stage as well. But it's different for the other members of the band as well. So you see early pictures of the band, they do not, quote, look like your goth icons. The classic sisters, in inverted commas, is the 84, 85 era, with the smoke, the lights, and more hair, more sunglasses, more hats, whereas that's not the kind of earlier era of the band.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Let's go back to 1983. This is where there's a shift in the power structure within the band. You write, the becoming of Andrew Eldritch was also a descent. Ben Gunn, who was the band's guitarist from 1981 to 83, he just can't work with Andrew anymore. This is when things start to fall apart?
No, not then. No, I don't think so. The inability to work with Eldritch is a given at any point in the Sisters story. I think that's probably true before he was even in a band. I think you can either get on with Eldritch or you can't. And that's the defining relationship in the group. Pete Turner, Phil Whiffin, no problems whatsoever. Ultimately, everyone who's in the band with him at some point has an issue with him, and they're not in the band anymore. So I think that's just like a basic part of Sisters' DNA, is that Eldritch is the leading figure of the band, and it's how the other members can adapt to that or tolerate that defines the progress of the group. Losing Ben Gunn, the second guitarist, as it were, is not going to kill off the Sisters of Mercy. He didn't write songs, and he's sort of like he's a minor figure in the group. He's very important, I think, actually, to the band's live sound, because the Sisters sound different with just one guitar. But he wasn't really writing and contributing in that sense. Very interestingly, he looks a little bit like sort of Hank Marvin or Elvis Costello. He's a very, very kind of on-rock and roll figure. And when you see pictures of the band from that 81 to 83 era, there's only really Eldritch who looks like he's got this rock star thing going on. So this idea of like the Sisters of goth overlords, just look at a picture of them with Ben Gunn in the band. There's a kind of disproving that myth. And then the big shift, I think, is with Wayne Hussey joining, because that shifts the relationship between Wayne Hussey, the guitarist, who then went on and had a long career in the Mission. Wayne Hussey, who was already like a very experienced guitarist, he'd already been signed to labels. That begins to shift the place in the band of Mark Pearman, Gary Marks. And that is the beginning of his journey to not being in the band anymore. But ultimately, it's his relationship with Eldritch is the reason he stopped being in the band eventually in 1985. So everything else is peripheral apart from your relationship with Eldritch. This is true of people who had some kind of managerial role with the band or had some role at the label. It doesn't really matter what the role is. It's, do you get on with Eldritch or do you not get on with Eldritch?
1985 is when you talk about the story where Andrew had collapsed from drugs, overwork, no sleep, he's not eating, taken to the hospital. the rest of the guys in the band were at the point where they basically didn't care if he died right there. And we're talking about Gary Marks, Wayne Hussey, Craig Adams. They leave around 1985.
So I qualify that. Essentially, the band is dying all through 1984 and 1985. It just takes a long, long time for the final end to come. It's a slow death. And parallel with this slow death, they become more and more successful. You know, they make an album, they go on bigger tours. It's a dichotomy. The band is dying and yet becoming more successful. There is this very, very grim episode of where they try and make the album, and Eldritch does become genuinely unwell for a variety of reasons. Medication, lack of sleep, lack of food, lack of daylight, stress, whatever. And yeah, he does have a collapse, and it's extremely grim. And Wayne Hussey and Craig Adams really are not that concerned. Gary Marks, yes, he was. And then it's him that's actually tried to get Eldritch to take a break. I didn't really have much luck with that. So I think to group Marks in with Adams and Hussey, that they'd all had enough of him in that sense, that they all look on and are indifferent to Eldritch's collapse, that wouldn't be strictly true. Marks is completely frustrated with him. Their relationship is fractured and irreparable, but his reaction to the collapse is different to Adams and Hussey. I think that distinction needs to be made.
The album is First and Last and Always, 1985.
Yeah.
What do you think of that album?
I have mixed feelings. Yeah, I'm one of these Sisters fans who have mixed feelings about it because it doesn't sound like the earlier singles at all. The band themselves had mixed feelings about it. So there's stuff on that which I'm not a massive fan of, you know, and it's also got some of my favorite Sisters tracks on as well. So it's a mixed bag for me. I know for some Sisters fans, it's pretty much the greatest record ever made. They totally respond to every single aspect of it, and they love the sound of it and the lyrics, everything.
What are the tracks you like from that album? Which are your standout tracks?
If you'd asked me before I started writing the book, I would say Some Kind of Stranger, the final track, simply because it's lyrically excellent and I like the guitar line in it a lot, which is heavily influenced by Roxy Music track, and I like that reference. But now I will go for 9 While 9, which is the simplest, least produced track on the album. And I think as a sort of breakup song, the music on it and particularly the guitar playing and the lyrics and the vocal delivery, I'd stand that up against any of the great breakup songs. I think just absolutely brilliant.
What about Black Planet? Black Planet was the US single off that.
Well, Black Planet's got this terrible video with it, which is a feature of Sisters in this period, is that all their videos are like somewhere between pretty poor and downright awful. And the Black Planet video, really, driving up and down near the port of Los Angeles in the Monkey Mobile. It's terrible. And it's not even the worst video they made. But yeah, Black Planet is a song which I've never liked that much. And I would pick that as the one that I warmed to on the album because of writing the book. I started to enjoy it a lot more. Wayne Hussey's guitar playing and Eldritch's lyrics, which I'd always sort of like skipped over a bit on the album because I prefer side 2. But yeah, Black Planet I actually started to like a lot more.
You know what I noticed though? What's interesting is a lot of times his voice is low in the mix, almost like he's just one of the instruments.
Yeah, I don't really know anything about music production, but at some point Eldritch works out how to double track his voice. And I'm guessing he's singing one at his natural pitch, which is his talking voice. And then he will be also using his Eldritch voice, which is the octave lower. But yeah, exactly what's going on First and Last and Always, you know, I'd have to listen again. And even then I might not be able to tell you. I know he does not like the sound of his voice on that album. He does not like the production on that album. And he spent ages trying to remix it, and he still doesn't like it. You know, he will tell you that he's made 2 good albums, which are Floodland and Vision Thing, and he has real reservations about that record.
Paint My Name in Black and Gold, The Rise of the Sisters of Mercy by Mark Andrews, and we're talking with Mark about the Sisters of Mercy. Let's get to 1987, Floodland. What led to the return of Andrew Eldritch and the Sisters of Mercy, that reboot in 1987? Would you call it a reboot?
Yeah, although, you know, the Sisters have been going for 40 years now, and the thread of it is Eldritch. So as long as he's in the band, it's not really a reboot. It's just a continuation. My book really kind of stops just as This Corrosion is made and Floodland and Vision Thing. And when the band reaches the peak of its commercial success, that's a different book. I wanted to write quite a narrow book because, what was it, 400 pages, something like that? It's about 100,000 words. Yeah, I thought that's about right for a 6-year period of the band. It's the sisters. They should have loads of books written about them. Bob Dylan's got 800 books in English written about him. Let's have lots of sisters books. I'm not going to write one covering the entirety of the band. It's not even my favorite era of the band, to be honest. I like Floodland and the singles. The singles are amazing off Floodland. The 3 singles.
This Corrosion,
fantastic.
Dominion, Lucretia, My Reflection, 3 singles off
They're
of that
fantastic.
album. Yeah.
God, they're good. So I didn't stop the book in about 1986, 87 because I've got anything against Floodland. Far from it. I know some Sisters fans, after First and Last and Always, the band is dead to them. There are some Sisters fans who, nothing after 83. I'm not one of those. I really enjoyed when they came back playing live, touring Vision Thing. I thought that was fantastic. I've seen them in big venues and they were great. And they really learned how to do that, which not all bands can do. But yeah, Eldritch went from these like clubs basically to learning how to put on a big show.
But essentially it's a 2-man band now. It's Andrew, it's a 1-man, 1-woman band. Andrew and Patricia Morrison.
It's essentially an Eldritch solo project in the sense that he's making the records and writing. And Patricia Morrison, who is an important and interesting musician and artist in her own right. God, I love the Gun Club. And she's important in the LA punk scene and the Bags. She's not that important to the music of the Sisters of Mercy. She's absolutely key to the visual presentation of the band, because Eldritch didn't tour Floodland, and Patricia Morrison, as part of that media onslaught, is absolutely essential. Whether or not she played or wrote anything for Floodland is immaterial. She's very important to that period that she's in the band as a duo. But creatively, I think it's an Eldritch solo project. You could argue that everything's an Eldritch solo project after 1985.
Well, there's another name we've left out, and a big name, Jim Steinman. He's part of this project, most famous for his work with Meatloaf, among others, produced this album with Andrew. Now, he hears the demo of the song This Corrosion. That persuades him to get on board?
Yeah, so this is right at the end of the book. I think this is right at the end of chapter 25. Eldritch was signed to WEA, Warner's UK in the UK and Elektra in the US, and the UK label thought it would be a good idea to get a superstar producer in. Whether Eldritch suggested Steinman to his A&R guy, Max Hole, who was a significant figure in the UK music industry, exactly how they come up with the idea of trying to get Steinman for a stupidly large amount of money to produce one single. Between them, Hole and Eldritch talked the label boss into trying this out, and Steinman agrees to produce it. And it's a great single. It's a really fantastic single. Made in New York at the Power Station.
It includes 6 backing singers, a 40-piece choir. And this marks the new phase in the history of the Sisters of Mercy, right? This is what you write in the book. And they wanted it to sound like a disco party run by the Borgias.
Well, that's how Eldritch pitched to him. He said, this is what I want, Jim. I want this to sound like a disco party run by the Borgias, which Eldritch felt that's exactly what he got. Eldritch has described Steinman, who he liked very much indeed, as an intelligent man, as well as a great record producer, great company, hugely eccentric. But Eldritch said what Steinman's interested in is the top deck, choirs, saxophone, oboes, all the kind of stuff, the decoration of the cake. And he said Steinman's just not that interested in the framework of the song. It's just all the kind of layers of stuff, which is, of course, exactly what This Corrosion needed. So, of course, Eldritch would tell you that most of the production he could have done better himself. And then what was great about Steinman is all the insane stuff that's just like smothered on top of it.
Jim Steinman passed in April of 2021, just as COVID was hitting, 73. Rest in peace to him. He was living in Connecticut, near where I am, and in the city of the radio station I worked at, Danbury, Connecticut. That's where he passed.
Okay.
He was right near New York. But Jim Steinman,
I love those first 2 Meatloaf albums. I had those way before I was into the Sisters. Those first 2 Meatloaf albums, I really like them. Although, of course, Steinman didn't produce the first one. It's Todd Rundgren. Steinman just wrote it.
In 1990, we get the Sisters of Mercy album, Vision Thing. Andrew brings in a brand new lineup. This lasts up through 1993, but there would be no more Sisters of Mercy albums after that. There were legal battles in the 90s, a possible new album in 06, never happened. Andrew did continue to perform on stage with his own Sisters of Mercy lineup, even performing new songs in their sets. What happened from 1990s Vision Thing forward?
Well, that would be a whole different book. Just to summarize in the broadest possible terms, Eldritch decided that he didn't want to be part of WEA anymore. And then after that, I think he decided that he could do without any form of record company. And at some point decided that he didn't need to make any records anymore in order to be perfectly happy as an individual and an artist. So, yeah, he plays live, he writes songs, and he has a life beyond recording and touring.
Frustrating for the fans.
Frustrating for the fans. Not for me, I'm one of these people who've always felt, and Eldritch would agree with me on this, is I don't feel he owes me anything. He doesn't feel he owes the people anything. But the strange thing is, in the past couple of years, he's written some really good sister songs that have been played live, and there have been some really good lyrics as well. He's never lost the ability as a lyricist. He's just lost the desire to make records and tour heavily and give a lot of his money to lawyers and record companies.
And what became of Gary Marks, Craig Adams, Ben Gunn, and Wayne Hussey?
Mark Perham and Gary Marks stopped being involved with music, but has not stopped being creative. He lives in West Yorkshire. Seems very, very happy with his life, happily married. We had long and detailed email exchanges. It was part of the process of writing the book. I did a long interview with him just before Christmas. So, yeah, he's just because he's not been playing in a band or making records, he's been busy and has done very well for himself. Craig still is a touring musician. His two main gigs are in Spear of Destiny and in The Mission. And that's true of Wayne Hussey as well. Wayne is still the main guy in The Mission. They still tour and still make records. Wayne lives in Brazil and Craig lives in Maryland.
One of them put out a book, didn't they?
Wayne, yeah, I've read that. Yeah, that's entertaining. Wayne put out a book called Salad Days, which basically stops when he leaves the Sisters of Mercy. I actually really enjoyed the bits of Wayne's book before he's a successful musician. That's often the case for me when I read music bios. The sort of struggling to get anywhere phase is often more interesting than album touring. So I like Wayne's book and I like Wayne, but I thought it was really good when he's just growing up and trying to be somebody and failing often and just going back and hammering away. Craig, I had interviewed a lot for the book as well. Craig, for some reason, never really got interviewed very much when he was in the Sisters. So I was always wondering if he would be interviewed for the book. But yeah, he did. We had several interviews. He's a great interviewee. And it's one of the fortunate things about the book is that I got to the end of it and I just didn't find, fortunately, that the people I was speaking to were twits or unpleasant. I got to the end of the process. I still like Wayne, still like Craig. Mark Perman's great. Eldritch, I have spoken to occasionally, more since the book was written. I like him. So it was great not to find a whole bunch of stuff in which your heroes, what do they say? Your heroes turn out to be assholes. This didn't happen. The Sisters did not go down in my estimation as a musical entity either. They went up. I was able to rediscover new things about them as well. So if the book's good, that's great. But it's just a relief to me that I didn't kill off my interest or respect for the band and the people in it.
And Dr. Avalanche has not aged a day. Still looks and sounds the same.
Doctor, now you see the Doctor, some of the stuff he got up to. Woo! Yeah. The women, the drugs, and also we're talking about four men in a touring rock band. There's in my book, nor on the cutting room floor that the lawyers made me take out, there isn't anything that terrible. There's some painful moments and there's some misbehavior, but no one does anything genuinely awful. If you consider the history of some other bands, nothing that bad.
And they've all lived to tell the stories, which is great. They're all alive and well. So let's get to the release date. Paint My Name in Black and Gold, The Rise of the Sisters of Mercy, is out on February 8th through Unbound Books in the U.S. and most places. But it has been out since November in, where was it again, you said before we started recording?
So the publisher is Unbound, who are based out of London. The book came out on November the 11th in the UK, and that's when the subscribers who pledged for the book to make it happen, they got their copies as well. The weird thing is that certain Amazon territories, you could order the book. So apparently Italians have managed to get the book through Amazon.it, but you will not get the book through Amazon.fr. But from February the 8th, it will be available in Europe and the US.
And you recommend just going to Amazon or any other websites you'd like people to go to? Unbound's website?
You can't order the hardback copy through Unbound, but you can order the ebook through Unbound. I don't know the best way to buy a book in Canada or the USA. So I don't know if those people who have ideological objections to Amazon and want to support small suppliers and distributors, I just don't know where to recommend.
Yeah, we could put up.
Amazon will be stocking it.
Right, Amazon. We'll put up links to various places that people can choose from. Unbound, Amazon. People can go to their local bookstore and look for a copy there. And I have a search for.
We'll have them order it.
Yes, on our website, bookedonrock.com. There's a link where you can just type in your zip code and it'll find the nearest bookstore. So all that stuff, we'll make sure we get that out. How about social media pages for you? Fans can reach out to you anywhere on social media.
Not me, Facebook? No, I don't. I'm on Facebook, but it's not really a big thing for me, and I don't tweet. I make the occasional appearance in the Heartland Forum, which is the Sisters Forum. That was really good to me when I was doing research. And I am a member of the Sisters of Mercy 80 to 85 Facebook group, which was super helpful and absolutely vital in researching the book as well. So
cool. People can look for you there. I'll put links up to those too, so people can go there. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, thanks so much. Like I said, love the book, but also introduced me to a band I'm now going to be listening to from here on out.
I would say to the listeners, if they wanted to experience the kind of range of the Sisters, you could try the political song of theirs called Fix, their heartbreak song, 9 While 9, and their outrageous cover of Jolene, or their outrageous cover of Emma. Those three songs would give you a sense of the range of the band. If you wanted something at more high tempo, and Eldritch would say gonzoid, then try Temple of Love in either of its versions.
We'll put those up. We got a playlist of Sisters of Mercy on the show notes page that people can listen to. First and Last and Always and Floodland. Those two really hit me right away, but I'll keep exploring more, some of those singles from the early days too. So there's a
compilation album of the early stuff, which is their great early stuff and the very early rubbish, called Some Girls Wander by Mistake. That kind of bundles it all together. Apart from the early rubbish single, that's pretty much wall to wall wonderful. The Sisters in that primitive but wonderful phase.
All right, Mark, thanks so much for being on the podcast. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks to Mark Andrews for taking us through his book, Paint My Name in Black and Gold, The Rise of the Sisters of Mercy. Make sure you subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We're on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/BookedOnRockPodcast and on Twitter at BookedOnRock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. If you're a publisher or author of a book and you want to be on the podcast, send me an email or contact me through our website, bookedonrock.com. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.